Welcome back everyone. In this video I'll be showing you how to change the front and rear inner tubes and tires on the Apollo City. The tools we'll be using in this video are a ratchet, a 17 and an 18 millimeter wrench, a pry bar with some tape on it, a battery drill, an air pump, a 17 millimeter socket, a Phillips head screwdriver, a 5 and a 4 millimeter Allen key, and also a 5 and a 4 millimeter bit. So to start off, we're going to unscrew the knob right here to release the brake line. Just like this, we can put that to the side. We can now remove the brake line from its bracket and pull it out of the guide pin. We can now remove the spring and let it hang on the side. The next step will be to remove our guide pin. The next step will be to take our 4 millimeter Allen key to remove our set screw. Just like this. We can now remove our lug nuts and pull the wheel out. We'll start on this side where we just have to remove the lug nut. Then we'll flip over to the other side where we show you how to remove the power cable. Now when loosening the lug nut, we want to hold the fork to keep the scooter in place. Now we only have our lock ring in place, and we'll keep that there for now because we need to work on the other side. We're now going to take our Phillips head screwdriver and unscrew the power cable bracket. Just like this, we can now slide this down and pull our power cable out. The next step will be to remove the lug nut cover, just like this. We can then take our 18 millimeter wrench and loosen the lug nut. When doing this, we want to hold the wheel because the other side is already removed. For this side, we don't have to remove the lug nut completely, so we'll just unscrew it enough to remove the lock ring. That should do it. We can now remove our lock ring just like this and do the same thing on the other side while still holding the wheel to make sure it doesn't fall out. And just like that, we can pull our wheel out of the forks. Now what we can do next is remove our lock ring and the washer right here. We can then pull our drum brake out. We can then unscrew our valve cap and remove all the air from the tire. That should do it. We can now take our 4 millimeter Allen key and start to unscrew the rim screws. Now we want to apply even pressure because we don't want to strip any of these screws. So now that we've started to loosen all the screws, I'm simply going to take my battery drill and remove them completely. There we go. Now that all of our 6 screws are removed, we can now remove the side rim. So now what we'll need to do is just take a pry bar, get the rim off of our tire. Once we have a little space, we can basically pull, and sometimes the tire will just come out, and we can then pull the rim off of the tire this way. There we go. So we can put this to the side. We can now take the old inner tube out and we're good for the reinstallation. So before we insert the inner tube, we need to make sure the tire is in the proper position. As we can see, the threading will show the tire should go this way, so we need to match it with the motor. The drum brake would usually go on the right side of the scooter, so we have the proper position for the tire. We can now take our inner tube. As we can see, the valve should go up, as there's more space to fill up the tire when the valve is on this side than the other. So we can first insert the inner tube in the tire. To make sure the inner tube is not pinched between the rim and the wheel, we're going to inflate it so it expands in the tire. So we'll just set it down right here. Take our pump. There we go. And we can inflate it a couple PSI until it fills the tire. That should be good. Now before we reinstall the tire, we can see here we need to reinstall the valve in its proper sitting position, so when we put the rim back on, the hole will align just like this. Now if we install the tire, we can see the edge is clear of any inner tube. Now we can align our hole with the one on the wheel and simply insert the rim just like this. We can now reinstall our screws and we'll go in a star pattern. So before we start, we can pinch the two sides of the wheel together to make sure there's no gap. There we go. We can now take the Allen key to torque them down. Now same with the unscrewing process. We want to apply even pressure to not strip any of the screws. There we go. We can now take our pump and inflate the tire. Now as indicated on the tire, we're going to fill the tire to 50 psi or 3.5 bar. We can now reinstall the drum brake, place it on our wheel, and take the washer and put it on top, just like that. We can now reinsert our wheel onto the forks. Now this might get a little tight, so don't be afraid to use a little bit of force, just like so. We can now place our lock rings back in their spot. The backside one too, and screw the first lug nut just tight enough so the wheel doesn't fall out. That should do it. We can now plug our power cable back in. Make sure to align both arrows when doing so, just like that. We can now take our bracket and screw it back on to its proper place and screw it in. That should do it. The next step will be to take our guide pin and insert it into our drum brake, just like that. We can then take our spring, insert it onto the brake cable, and put the brake line back into its bracket. We can then guide the brake cable through the pin, just like so. We can now take our knob and screw it on. We can always pull the drum brake to get enough spacing to screw the knob on. That should be good for now. We'll adjust it at the end once everything is tightened properly. The last step for the drum brake here is to align the hole with the fork right there. We can now take our set screw and torque it down. We'll take our 4mm Allen key to finish the job, and that should do it. As we can see, our drum brake does not move from its place. We can now take our lug nut, screw it back on. We can then take our 18mm wrench and tighten both sides. Now, just like before, keep a hand on the wheel or the fork just to keep the scooter stable. That should do it. Now let's do the same thing on the other side. And there we go. Now that our drum brake is fully reinstalled, we can put the cover back on our lug nut, just like so. We can now readjust our drum brake and we'll be good to go. Now to adjust the drum brake, we simply want to push the arm forward, just like this, so we can relieve the tension on the brake line to tighten the knob right here. Let's try this. and go see if our brake is tight enough. As we can see, the brake is nice and tight now. Now for the front wheel, we'll start by removing the caliper with our 5mm Allen key. There we go. We can then take either two 17mm wrench, but I'm going to use a 17mm socket and a wrench. Now that we have one nut off, we can simply pull the shaft out while holding the wheel. And mind you that there are two spacers inside the forks, so we'll also remove these. That's one and two. Now this process can be very easy, but if the shaft is being difficult, we can also use a punch or a screwdriver to push it out. Now what we'll want to do is remove the valve cap and remove the air from our tire. There we go. We can now take our 5mm Allen key and undo the 3 screws. There we go. We can now take the rim off and remove the tire. We can now pull the inner tube out of the tire just like this. Now before we put the inner tube in the tire, we want to make sure it's properly aligned. So as we can see, the wheel would be this way, so the tire would be this way. As we can see, the tread is going forward. We can now take our inner tube and insert it into our tire. The trick for the front tire is having the valve on the opposite side of the disc, as it's easier to refill the air. Now before we put the rims back together, we want to inflate the inner tube just a bit. This will ensure that the inner tube is not pinched. Now when reinstalling the tire, we want to make sure the valve sits in the proper position, just like this. And the same for the other side of the rim. So we'll align the both of them together, just like this. We can take our screws and reinsert them into their holes, but first we want to push down on the rim so there's no space in between. I'm now going to take the Allen key and torque them down. Now that the screws are torqued down, we can reinflate the tire and reinstall the wheel on the scooter. Now just like the back wheel, we're going to inflate it to 50 psi or 3.5 bar. We can now put the valve cap back on and reinstall it on the scooter. Now before we put the wheel back on, we want to put the shaft with the first spacer just to hold it in place. We can now take our wheel and push the shaft through. We can now take our second spacer and insert it on the other side. There we go. As we can see, the shaft is coming out. So we can take our nut and screw that in. We can now take our wrench and ratchet and secure the shaft in place. There we go. We can now reinstall the caliper, which will go behind the forks. Now we want to make sure these two are torqued down because they secure the caliper in place. There we go. And that's how you replace the front and rear tire and inner tube on the Apollo City.